welcome everyone. I met Lee here just about a week ago to make sure we could work all the technology, because being of an older generation, it doesn't come naturally to me, at least. So I need guys like Adam back there to, to figure out how to get the Wi-Fi connected and all the rest. And when Lee and I were talking last night here and at the Four Aces Diner, which I have fond memories of, we got talking a little bit about my dad, because I didn't really think of this at the time when I contacted the Lebanon Historical Society, but coming here is a lot of fun for me, because this is where my dad grew up. He was born in McIndoe Falls, Vermont, which is in the town of Barnet. But that was 1924. And when the Depression came along in 29? Yeah. So things weren't going well at the East Reigate paper mill, where my grandfather he'd moved from pulling logs out of the woods for George Van Dyke to working in the mill, probably a steadier, warmer job in the winter, I don't know. But when the Depression happened, I'm guessing that maybe some of the men were laid off, or the mill slowed down. At any rate, my grandmother was an Italian from Barry whose mother died when she was 11, and she lived with her older sister until she could graduate from a teacher training program. And then she went to be a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse over in North Reigate. And then she ended up in the school next to the paper mill, and somehow or other she and my grandfather bumped into each other. And when he needed work, her sister was down here in West Lebanon, living, just down the street, I guess it would be this way. And there's a residential neighborhood just after you go through the intersection up on the right. And her sister, Annie Marchetti, was there. And Annie's husband owned Twin State Fruit, Twin State Produce Company. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Yes. So it doesn't still exist, right?
Under a different name, I believe.
Does it really? Huh?
Twin State Fruit is
yeah. Well, my grandfather went to work there too. He became a salesman for the next 40 years. And so my father grew up here in West Lebanon. He, as a boy, he was taught woodworking skills, and he built boats, and he built a kayak. And before Wilder Dam was built, he used to run the rapids about where the dam, somewhere in that area where the dam is now. And so when he passed away, he was cremated, and his ashes are now in the river at the foot of the dam, somewhere in the sediment there. So I have strong sentimental feelings for West Lebanon. So as Lee and I were talking, there is a little bit of history related here. He became a school teacher, a shop teacher, and he taught for 19 years in Hartford, across the river at the junior high. And he had a lot of, acquaintances in town here. And he got an obsession with the Highland bagpipes. He had, there was nobody in the family involved with them, but he used to listen to them on the radio. He used to listen to the Black Watch broadcast from Canada, and he just fell in love with the pipes and learned to play. And he and another fellow started a band, a pipe band. It was called the Pipers of Bendu. And this is the head to the bass drum. As you can see, West Lebanon, New Hampshire. This was mid to late 1950s, I guess. I was born in 51, and we moved up to this part of the world 2 years later. So this had to be, well, actually, the day I was born, my mother always teased him a little bit about this. I asked about my birthday, as many of us do, and she said, well, I wasn't sure whether your dad was more excited about your arrival or the arrival of his first set of bagpipes, because he brought them to the hospital to show my mother. She had something to show him, but I guess it was a contest. So anyway, this was the drum head to the band. My brother has this on the wall in his living room up in Johnson, Vermont. And I'll pass this around. It fell off the wall. It's a little bit tender, but if anything happens to it, don't worry, I'll get another frame. And I'll start this one from this side. This is a book that my dad wrote. Quite a bit of it is about growing up in West Lebanon in the 1930s and 1940s. It's called Goodbye Highland Yankee. So you can take a look at that. And as a high school English teacher, I was always cautioned, don't start a talk by giving your students something to look at, because they won't pay any attention to you. But I'm not worried about that. You know, you can, I'm sure you can do two things at once, and I know I've had to more than once. So anyway, so I have a personal connection here. Just a quick introduction to, you know, what this talk is about and how, well, what the theme is maybe. It says forgotten people of the Upper Valley. And that term, the Upper Valley, I wondered as I thought about it, you know, like so many things in life when I was younger, you know, I take many things for granted, and I just, Upper Valley, well, that's, everybody knows where that is. That's Lebanon, Hanover, you know, Hartford, Windsor, and so on. And I looked it up, and I guess it was a phrase coined by the Valley News back in the 50s. And so it meant, you know, pretty much their circulation area. But different people have interpreted it in different ways, I guess. And so I'm going to use poetic license tonight. And for tonight, for the purposes of tonight, it's going to mean from the Massachusetts state line. Glad you got a sense of humor, because well, actually to right here, let's just, the people we're going to talk about, all of them, there are 10 of them in that little booklet. I'm only going to talk about 7 if I'm lucky enough to get through those. And they all lived up and down the river, on either side of the river. And Lee and I were, you know, going back and forth about Vermont versus New Hampshire, and one side of the river versus the other. And I understand rivalries. You know, I taught high school in Bethel, and there was a constant rivalry with Rochester over the mountain. But I also understand a sense of community, and Tom Slayton, who was the editor of Vermont Life magazine for many years, said that the Upper Valley is actually a community unto itself. And the people of the Upper Valley have more in common with each other, even though they might live on different sides of the river, than they do with some other parts of their own state. And I think my dad felt this was true, because people west of the Green Mountains in Vermont were very different from people east of the Green Mountains. And he felt that, you know, he was very familiar with people on the New Hampshire side of the river or the Vermont side of the river. And my own family had a lot of history both in Vermont and New Hampshire. I was born in New Hampshire. My father was born in Vermont. My grandfather was born in New Hampshire. My great-grandfather was born in New Hampshire. My great-grandfather ran logs down the Connecticut River here. And when my father built boats, I remember a story he told me how my great-grandfather came down, went for a ride once in one of his boats. And he was a, you know, typical taciturn Yankee from New England, didn't say a lot, was smoking his pipe. My dad is rowing, and my great-grandfather says, "Scotty, you see that rock over there?" And my father says, "Yep." And he says, "Do you see that ring in that rock?" And my father looked more closely, and he says, "Yeah, because that's where we used to boom the logs here before we sent them on down the river." So I just love the, you know, I love the history of this area, and that's what I want to share with you. I decided when somebody asked me to do a talk that I wanted to learn more about the river and about the people who lived here. So let's go ahead with that. And well, I've got to sign in again. So I think that this first picture is, given all this, is a fairly appropriate picture to start with. Anybody recognize this scene?
Yes.
What it?
Windsor Bridge.
Exactly. If you live in Cornish, it's the Cornish-Windsor Bridge. If you live in Windsor, it's the Windsor-Cornish Bridge.
I grew up in Windsor. So.
Oh, you did? So you recognize it. It's supposedly the longest covered bridge in America. A Scutney behind it. And so I think it represents that connection and that community of the Upper Valley, the two sides of the river. The only other thing I want to say before I get started is that booklet that you have, one of the things I really love is learning about history in a book and then learning about it out on the ground somewhere. And so on the back page there's a map, and it's a picture of the Connecticut, the Twin States, and there are numbers along the river. And they correspond to numbers inside the back cover. So if you look inside the back cover, you'll see 1 through 10, and all those numbers correspond to the 10 people in the booklet. Ami Young, who grew up here, was born here in Lebanon, I think, and so on and so on. And so, after this talk is over, if at some time you want to go out and see some of these places, like the observatory on the Dartmouth campus that Ami Young designed with his brother, Professor Ira Young, in mind. You can go to the Dartmouth College campus and see that observatory, see the 3 dormitories that Ami Young designed on the campus, and so on with the rest of those numbers in that book. They all, these people are long gone, but there are little vestiges that they left behind, and some of those can still be seen. So, here's the first person in this list of forgotten people, Ami Young, and I suspect that he's not forgotten by some of the people here. He lived in the house in the upper left corner there. That's 55 Mascoma Street. It's still there. It's an apartment house now, I believe. I think the porch was added after the original house was built. You can still see some of the classical Greek revival style in it. Very simple, but very tasteful. So Captain Samuel Young and Rebecca Burnham Young came here from Hopkinton, and Ami Young, those were Ami Young's parents, and he grew up here in Lebanon. He was working for his father by the age of 14. There were some wonderful builder architects back in those days. They were skilled woodworkers. Ami's grandfather, if you go to Hopkinton, New Hampshire sometime, go to their Historical Society, and you can see some of the work his grandfather did, David Young, linen chests and clock housings, beautiful work. So Ami went to work for his father. He married in the early 1820s. His wife died soon after they married, the same year that their only child was born, a daughter named Helen. I don't know if it was in childbirth, it might have been. It happened a lot back then. But it's pretty certain that he was involved in the design and the building of this church, which I believe, was dated 1828. It's a church in your town. You probably all know it well. I had to stop there and just take a closer look, and it really is a beautiful, beautiful piece of work, and it's been kept up very well. So my compliments to the people who have been responsible for that. He got off to a good start. His father must have been a talented person, and he went to Boston apparently for a while and worked under an architect there. The Federalist style and the Greek Revival style had really come to this country from an architect named Adams in Scotland, and in England, of course, was, this was not all that long after the Renaissance had reached England, and there was such a love of the Greek and Rome, and especially the Greek aesthetic for architecture. So the architects began incorporating this into regular houses, public buildings. A guy named Asher Benjamin is well known in this part of the world. He wrote 7 books that were handbooks for builders to give them patterns and designs of Federalist and Greek Revival architecture. So, and it's pretty sure that that congregational church is based on a pattern from the American Builder's Companion. So I'm told, or so I read. So he went on to Burlington because the canal had been completed between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River, and Burlington now became a pretty busy place, shipping between New York City and Montreal and the St. Lawrence. And there was a lot of opportunity for work there. And he designed this house, which still exists in Burlington. It was falling down, it was a ruin, but the Pomerleau Real Estate Agency bought it and decided to restore it. Beautiful Greek Revival architecture, which is often with the columns and with this detail, this horizontal detail between eaves on either side. You can see the similarity to the Temple of Theseus in Athens. So he begins to build his reputation, and his reputation really is made when he gets the contract to design Vermont State House. And this is the State House. This is a picture from the Vermont Historical Society taken in 1850, not too long after cameras were actually becoming real technology, usable technology. And you can see the similarity between this Doric portico and the Temple of Theseus here. And in 1857, sadly, does the present State House look like this? Is anybody familiar with Montpelier? It does not, because this burned in 1857. The modern dome, of course, is much taller, and it has a statue on top, and we'll get to that later. But this, according to Stanford White, was the most beautiful example of Greek Revival architecture in America at the time he saw it. Stanford White worked for McKim, Mead, and White. He was one of the three partners. And the Mead was Rutherford Mead, who was a brother to Larkin Goldsmith Mead, who's one of these forgotten people we're going to get to later. So connections galore. Anyway, and Stanford White, by the way, was the one who was shot by Harry K. Thaw in the early 1900s. If any of you have ever read the book Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, it was a big scandal in America. Apparently Stanford White had seduced this young woman, Evelyn Nesbit, who was a showgirl, and Harry K. Thaw married her later. He was pretty unstable and he was pretty rich, and he shot Stanford White in a public place. I can't remember if it was, I think it was Boston, it may have been New York. Anyway, it was the stuff that novels are made of. So he builds his reputation, and he becomes the supervising architect of the U.S. Department of Treasury. He moves to Washington because the Treasury, this is the 1850s, and it's not that long after the United States has become a republic, and so this is still under construction. He put in plans to finish the U.S. Capitol, but he didn't he didn't get that job, but he did get this one. And so he goes to Washington and goes to work, and we're going to come back to him. He shows up again. If we move down the river on the other side, on the Vermont side, and go to Windsor, we come to William Maxwell Evarts, born a little later than Ami Young, 1818. His portrait, you can see the initials here, WH stands for William Morris Hunt. He was one of a number of very talented siblings, mostly brothers, born in Brattleboro. William Morris Hunt became a well-known artist in America, and particularly in Boston. And you'll see him in your booklet if you look at it later. At any rate, that's a portrait of him. Let's see, how old was he then? 52, I guess, something like that. So he was born into a Boston Brahmin family. I always wondered what that meant, and I looked it up, and Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly in 1860 about the Brahmins in Boston, just meaning that they were wealthy. They lived in Beacon Hill and the Back Bay. They were from Puritan stock. If you if you want a better idea of what all that story is about, I highly recommend The Late George Apley by George Marquand. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, it's a funny name. But he wrote this novel that was actually edited by this guy's grandson. Maxwell Perkins was his grandson. And Maxwell Perkins worked for Charles Scribner and Sons and was the editor for Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe and George P. Marquand, who wrote The Late George Apley, which is about these Brahmins, these Boston Brahmins who lived on Beacon Hill, and you know, what their lifestyle was all about. So Evarts goes to Yale, becomes a lawyer. Well, he gets his law degree, and before he really becomes a lawyer, he goes to Windsor, Vermont, and practices law. He teaches to keep body and soul together. He meets Helen Wardner, and they get married in 1843. Helen Wardner was the daughter of Alan Wardner, and if you remember the Cornish-Windsor Bridge at the beginning, Alan was one of a small group of businessmen and interested parties in Windsor who pulled together enough money in the 1820s to build that bridge. So William married into a family that was, you know, well-to-do in their place and time, and he was also. He coined the term the Connecticut River aristocracy, and he was one to know because his maternal grandfather was Roger Sherman, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. So very well connected. He went to New York City. They had a number of children. He worked as an attorney in New York City and handled some high-profile cases. And eventually, he worked for the government. He defended, what's the fellow's name who took over for Abraham Lincoln? Johnson. Andrew Johnson, thank you. When Johnson went through an impeachment trial, Evarts was part of the defense team, and the judge in that trial was Salmon Chase. I don't know if that rings a bell. But Salmon P. Chase, if you go down through all the box stores and head south on 12A and get back to Cornish, there is a beautiful old Federalist or Greek Revival house on the left that will have a historic marker there, and it's the birthplace of Salmon Chase. And I'm going to get back to him later, but he presided over this trial that Evarts also worked at. It's a little ironic that Evarts was defending the president because a couple generations later, I believe it was either his, I think it might have been his great-grandson, don't quote me on that, it's in the booklet, but Archibald Cox. Does that name ring a bell? Yes, the Watergate hearings, and Nixon was being impeached, you know, 100-something years later. And Archibald Cox was a descendant of William Maxwell Evarts, and of course he was the special prosecutor in that trial, so he was on the other side of the courtroom. In 1904, so by this time, Evarts is a highly respected attorney, and he went on to be, let's see, U.S. Attorney. He was a Secretary of State. He worked in Rutherford Hayes administration. Rutherford Hayes has a Vermont connection because his family actually came from Brattleboro. His grandfather still lived in Brattleboro. And what else? Oh, he became the attorney for the state of New York to the U.S. Congress. Evarts did. So then he retires in the late 1800s and comes back to Windsor and lives at the White House. This house is still there. And in 1904, when Roosevelt is running for president, he's making a campaign tour in New Hampshire and Vermont. He arrives in Windsor Winston Churchill drives him in a coach or carriage to Windsor. It's not Winston Churchill from Great Britain. It's a Winston Churchill who is part of the Cornish artist colony, Augustus St. Gaudens and so on, and Churchill was a writer. So he brings Teddy Roosevelt over to the White House, they called it, William Everett's house and Helen's house. It's all decorated for the occasion, and they have some kind of reception there. And then they go to Paradise. So the Everett's family owned, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of acres on both sides of the river. And this is just down the street. If you go to Windsor and you have a smartphone, you can download a barcode app, and right by the Windsor, what's it called? The Windsor House, which is the big hotel, right there as you come into the downtown. It's got the huge pillars out front. It's been restored by Windsor Historic Preservation. And right near the People's Bank there, you'll see a little sign that will start you on this historic Windsor walking tour. And you can take your barcode reader and hold it up to the sign, and your phone will soon start talking to you, and you can walk down North Main Street and get a little history about the 6 Everett's homes. Well, you won't get all 6, but you'll get at least 3 of them, where Archibald Cox lived and where Maxwell Perkins lived and so on. And then when you get down to the Constitution House, which the Everett's family saved from really terrible neglect and falling down. They moved it from the middle of town where it used to be and donated the land where it is now on the north end of the village, and helped begin the process of renovating that really historic building. If you go down to the Constitution House, walk to the left of it, walk out back, no one will mind. There's a path that will take you out into this field, and it looks a little different now. But when Everett's son Charles came home after the Civil War, he was an engineer. This used to be a big swamp called Polk Hole, and when he came back, he designed a lake there. It's now called Lake Runnymede, and this is all lake, and about this time of year, I think April. And this was the Everett's farm here. This is all gone because it burned in a huge fire. But one thing does remain. There's a house over here, and this brick building is still there. The kind lady at the Historical Society took me over there, and we met she knew the resident there, and he took us on a little tour. This was the Baptist church behind the Everett's house in the village. And when the Baptists decided they needed a new and better church, Everett's, being a pretty civic-minded and well-liked person in Windsor, offered to buy it. They took the steeple off it. They hauled it with oxen down to this part of town, and they set it on a foundation. And this became the piggery for the Everett's farm. So the gentleman showed me their doors on the other side where the pigs could run out and frolic in their pasture all day. And then in the fall, doomsday came, and in this section there's a separate room, and they slaughtered the pigs and scalded them and processed them for winter use. So these are the little bits of history, the kinds of things that I love to dig into. It's so much fun to go to local historical societies and get that kind of information. So we'll leave Everett's for now and come to Colonel Levitt Hunt. So he's the brother of the guy that did Everett's portrait. William Morris Hunt did the portrait. This is one of his brothers. They had another brother, Richard, who was a famous architect and designed the Vanderbilt Mansion, amongst others, in Newport, Rhode Island. These people were high rollers. But a sad thing happened to these brothers and their sister. Their father died when they were all relatively young, and their father was in his early 40s, I think. And their mother, who was a strong-willed, intelligent woman, decided they would all go to Europe for an education because she wanted to complete her own education, which she felt had been hampered by her father a little bit. It was also recommended by a doctor that William could stand a little milder climate than we have here in New England. So they went to France and Italy and so on, and Levitt went to a Swiss military school. And then he went to law school in Heidelberg, Germany. And then after he graduated, he and a friend named Nathan Flint Baker traveled to the Middle East. Now, this is, you got to remember, this is, I don't know, 1852 or something like that. It's early 1850s. So traveling in the Middle East, well, it's probably more dangerous today, I don't know. But there were very few trains, if any. They took a dahahiya. It's a primitive boat that's been on the Nile River for centuries. And they made a trip down the Nile. And they saw some of the 7 wonders of the world. Oh, this is where they lived in Brattleboro, by the way. This is High Street and Main Street here. And that was their house, which is now a Thai restaurant. Went from this beautiful 19th century home to a gas station, and then eventually to a Thai restaurant. Anyway, they go to the pyramids of Egypt, and they take some of the earliest photographs that we have in the Middle East. There are some that are earlier, perhaps more famous, but there weren't that many being taken because the camera had not been around for very long. They continued around the Mediterranean to the cliffs of Petra and other sites and ended up in Greece. And you can see some of those photographs in the Bennington Museum in Vermont. So Levitt, let's see, he came back to the States. He went to law school here. I can't remember whether it was Harvard or Yale, but it was one of the Ivy League schools. And he became a lawyer. He became a lawyer in New York City. Eventually, he met Catherine Jarvis. And I don't think I mentioned that we've moved down the river now to Wethersfield, specifically Wethersfield Bow. So if you're in your car and making this trip, and you head south from Windsor on Route 5, on the left, you'll sort of come out into this open area, and it's called Wethersfield Bow because if you look at a map, there's actually a bow out into the river. The land bows out into the river. There used to be a ferry there. And it's beautiful farmland. William Jarvis came here after he finished being U.S. consul in Portugal. He came back to the States with merino sheep. Probably some of you know this story. And he bought 2,000 acres and became a sheep farmer in a big way. And kind of helped change the historical and even the environmental landscape of Vermont and Hampshire, because sheep farming took off like crazy, and people started cutting down even more trees, and this is when stone walls became, began to replace split rail fences and so on. So this house is still there. Jarvis died in 1859. Catherine and Levitt were in Scotland on their honeymoon. They got married about that time, but then they had to come back because America was pretty troubled and the Civil War was about to start. And so they came back, and Levitt enlisted in '61. He made it through the war with a distinguished service. He was blind in one eye coming back from the war. I'm not sure what the story is behind that. He came back here with Catherine. Her brother actually was supposed to inherit the estate, but he died in the war. So Catherine and Levitt come back here. They called it Elms Home. They farmed it as he farmed it as a gentleman farmer, but lots of help. There were lots of hired hands there. And they lived there the rest of their lives. They partook of a fad that a lot of Vermonters and New Hampshire people do now, where if you're in your later years and you really can't stand the winter up here anymore, you go somewhere else, right? So they went somewhere else, only it wasn't that far. They went to Claremont during the winter. And they would live at the Claremont Hotel. And actually, Claremont, I think, back then was a very different place than it is now. The mills were very busy and very successful, and I imagine it was quite a thriving community at that point. It was also one of the healthiest, most prosperous farming communities in the 1800s prior to the mills being there. So it was quite a town. So they went there. He died in 1907. 12 years before he died, he lost his sight in the other eye, so he was blind for the last 12 years. And he's buried in the Bowen Hill Cemetery across from that red house, almost across, a little bit toward Windsor. There's Bowen Hill Road. If you want to see where he and Catherine are buried and some of the children, you can see their stones in that cemetery. So, I'm bringing family in here again. My apologies, but you know how popular genealogy is now. This is Amos Hastings. Well, that's not him, but he was my third great-grandfather. I really knew nothing about him until the last few years when I got interested in family history. And I think that students in school, instead of studying history and starting with a huge picture, maybe sometimes it's better to start local, even with your own family. Because I think when you have a personal connection, it starts to mean more. And then maybe you could branch out. At any rate, my grandfather was about the same age as Levant, 1 year older. He's born in Grantham, New Hampshire. When he comes of age, he needs a trade. He goes to apprentice to his Uncle John in Bethel, Maine, who's a blacksmith. And he learns that trade quite well. Here's a quick little aside. I went to Bethel a couple summers ago, and I tracked down some of my distant relatives. And one of them was the director of the Historical Society. He had just retired a year or so earlier, and he invited us to his house, which had seen 5 generations of the Hastings family. And he brought me into the front parlor. Well, there were 2 parlors. There was a women's parlor, and a men's parlor. I was interested in both, but particularly in the men's parlor, there was a Revolutionary War musket hanging on the wall, and it belonged to my 5th great-grandfather, Amos Hastings, who this guy was named after. And then he took us out to the barn, which was in classic Yankee style, chock a block full. They never threw anything away. You know, there were carriages out there and plows and everything you can think of, including the bellows and the anvil from the blacksmith shop where my Uncle John had worked and where my 3rd great-grandfather apprenticed. So he becomes a blacksmith. He marries Nancy Sawyer. They have 4 kids, I think, before the Civil War breaks out. He actually came to Lebanon in 1855 and worked as a blacksmith here for about 5 years. And then in 1861, he enlists. You know, here's a guy, 31 years old with 4 kids, and he enlists. He enlists with the 2nd U.S. Regiment Sharpshooters Company G, which were New Hampshire men. He goes to Washington for a short time, and then his regiment goes to the Peninsula War, Second Battle of Bull Run, and so on. They start with 600 or 700 men. By the time they're done, they have 150 to 200, somewhere in that range. A year or so later, he's at Antietam. And they're coming down the Hagerstown Pike toward the Dunker Church, and they're pushing the Confederates back, and they're doing quite well. General Abner Doubleday is in charge of the whole thing, and things are going well until they come to John Bell Hood's Texans, who have forced marched all night to get there, and are in a really cranky mood, and they're eating breakfast, and their breakfast is interrupted, and so they come screaming the rebel yell out of the woods and turn the tide, and then this is a seesaw battle for hours and hours, and it goes the other way. And my great-grandfather jumps over a split-rail fence, and on the other side it drops away. And he injures himself so badly that when he writes later asking for a pension, he says he can't carry a 10-quart pail of water more than 40 yards or 40 feet, or but he's injured. So he goes back home. Well, actually, he doesn't go home right away, because he goes to this place. And this is from the Library of Congress. I don't know if this is one of Matthew Brady's photos, but there are a couple of guys who are taking a lot of Civil War pictures. And this is in Alexandria, Virginia, Camp Convalescence that a lot of the men called Camp Misery. If you went in there, you weren't too sure whether you were coming out again. And he was in here for quite a while, and then I think he got moved into a different location, but still enlisted, still, you know, they're hoping he'll go back and fight, I guess. He just couldn't do it. I don't know the details, but he's finally discharged. I found his discharge papers in September of 1863. Antietam was in September of 1862, and it was one of the bloodiest battles in American military history, bar none, including World War II and all the rest. About a year later, he's discharged, and I find that his father, Jonas, dies in that same month. There's an obituary for him. I don't know whether he made it back to his father's funeral or not, but they did let him go. So he goes back to Vermont and New Hampshire, and for the rest of his life, he travels up and down the Connecticut River as a kind of an itinerant with his family, and they live in Claremont for a while, and Bellows Falls, and this area, and way up in Littleton and so on. And he's a teamster. He just, whenever he can get a job driving horses, he does that. But I think he probably had, you know, their equivalent of PTSD, I don't know. Down to Westminster now from Wethersfield, still on the Vermont side, we've got William Czar Bradley. Apparently his father admired Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, who was a learned man apparently. And I love this guy. He's just kind of an eccentric character. He knew a lot of these other people in the Connecticut River aristocracy. He was a very respected lawyer, like his father. He was also a U.S. senator, and he was eccentric. He practiced, he didn't go to New York City. He practiced right here in Vermont, or, you know, right on the river in the Upper Valley. And there are a couple of quick stories about him that I think reveal some of his character. One is that when he was 13, he was a bit of a prodigy, and I think it was Yale. I think he went to Yale, and he got kicked out. And the story goes that when the chaplain went to the college chapel one Sunday morning, he got inside and there was a donkey in the pulpit. And they pinned it on William. He insisted it was not him. I wasn't sure whether this was an editorial comment about the chaplain's eloquence or, you know, I suspect so. But at any rate, they pinned it on him, so he was kicked out. He said he never did it, but he did worse things which they never accused him of. So the other story about him, he becomes an attorney, and he had this dog, this little long-haired dachshund named Penny, who, as you can see, was nearsighted. This is a family photo, so he did have a sense of humor. And he would take the dog to court. And one day he's making an eloquent plea on behalf of his client, and he finishes, and he sits down, and the courtroom is obviously, you know, everyone's impressed. And the opposing attorney gets up, and he's trying to make up for lost ground, and he's gesticulating rather wildly, and he's getting dramatic, and he's getting rather loud, and Penny gets excited, and she begins to bark. And William says, "Hist, hist, Penny, only one dog at a time." So, humorous, eccentric character. There is a bust of him at the Vermont Historical Society done by Larkin Goldsmith Mead, who's going to be the last guy we'll get to. There's also, speaking of places that you can visit, if you go down to Westminster, you might want to call ahead and ask for an appointment. But somewhere around 2008 or 2010 or something like that, the state of Vermont got a call, and John Dumville, who's a well-known historian in Vermont, said he went down to Westminster and the family had bequeathed the law office that belonged to William Bradley. And it was closed up after he died and left exactly the way it had been. And he walked into this and he said it was the closest I could get to discovering King Tut's tomb. You know, he walked in And Bradley's ear trumpet was there. He had scarlet fever when he was a little kid and he was deaf. His ear trumpet was there. A pair of his pants was there. I don't know why. The women I talked to said they could both get in one pant leg. He was a huge guy, apparently. His law books were there. Very interesting little discovery. And the Historical Society there has been renovating it and restoring it. And you can visit it yourself if you so desire. Just get in touch with them. They also have a wonderful collection in the town hall on the second floor. They're lucky to be one of the few towns, I think, that has a lot of space and a lot of interesting artifacts there from the town's history. So that's William. This is the Willard Hotel. And I'm going to skip over this. I'll just say that Henry Willard was also from southern Vermont. Henry married William's granddaughter, Sarah Bradley Willard. And they ended up in Washington, D.C. And this is a very famous hotel. It burned. It's been replaced. There still is a Willard Hotel. This is the one that was there in the 1800s. This is the one that Lincoln stayed in. And the White House is nearby. This is on Pennsylvania Avenue, and the U.S. Treasury is nearby. So I'll come back to this in a couple minutes, but I want to go to Kareena Howard Nichols first. She is quite an interesting woman. There are a couple of books about her. Revolutionary Heart is one, and if you look at the little bibliography in your booklet, you can find these references. She grew up in Townsend. This is what Lee was talking about, that he could see from his window. Her parents were devout Baptists. This was the time of the Second Great Awakening, a sort of Christian revival. And she married a guy named, I think his name was Justin Carpenter. His last name was Carpenter. It was a bad marriage. They left home seeking their fame and fortune. The Erie Canal had been completed not too long before this, and they went west on the Erie Canal and settled in Brockport, New York. She started a school. He started nothing. He was a ne'er-do-well, spending her dowry, and eventually she decided enough was enough, and she filed for divorce. Now back then, nowadays, oh, you're getting a divorce, so it's not, too big a deal. Back then it was a pretty big scandal. She came back home. Fortunately, her parents did not disown her. They embraced her. An interesting thing, when she came back, she began to write in the newspapers a little bit because she was kind of passionate about women's rights. She really had no rights when she divorced her husband. Her husband really was entitled to anything she had. Any property she had was her husband's, including the clothes on her back. And custody rights were all in favor of the husband. So she began to bring this to people's notice, saying, does this really make sense? Is this fair? Is this just? And it came to the attention of Larkin Goldsmith Mead Sr., we're going to get to him. His son was a sculptor. The father was an attorney, and he began to try and bring some reforms to the Vermont legislature. Kareena, after a while, meets a guy named George Nichols, who's 25 years older than she is. He's the editor of the Windham County Democrat. I think it was probably less of a scandal to marry an older man like that. It happened not all the time, but it wasn't unheard of. And they did get married, and they were well suited to each other. But she was still relatively young when he was in his 60s and his health was failing. And she took over the paper. And she began to write editorials, op-ed pieces, and put out the paper on a regular basis. And she became so well known as an advocate of women's rights, she went to the Vermont legislature, and I believe she was the first woman to really do this in the Vermont legislature, to make a plea for women's rights. There was a man named Barrett, who was the chairman of the House Education Committee, who spoke to the papers. He probably shouldn't have opened his mouth, but before she came, he said, "Let her come. I don't believe in this scramble for men's breeches, and she'll go back with her tail between her legs," or something like that. Well, she got there, And there were a number of women in the gallery listening and enjoying her poise and her articulate speech. And she argued quite rationally and convincingly that a woman who earned her own way, who paid for the clothes on her back, shouldn't have to give, you know, and say nothing of bridges, have to give her own women's clothes to her husband. And if she had children, she should have some rights and some kind of say in their custody if the two of them separated. So she was a very early social reformer. I mean, there were plenty of other women who were working on this at this point, but I don't know that as many people know about her. She was so dedicated. She was also an abolitionist, and when Kansas was struggling to decide whether it was going to be a free state or a slave state, she went out there with her family and, you know, settled there so that, you know, part of it depended on how many free staters there were and how many pro-slavery people there were. Her son Aurelius was at the Battle of Blackjack with a guy named John Brown fighting against the pro-slave factions. It was a pretty violent, pretty turbulent time. Okay, so we're going to go back now for a minute just to talk about how interesting these connections. I had no idea how many little connections could be made, but here's this Willard Hotel. So Ami Young, if you remember, goes to Washington in the early 1850s. He becomes the supervising architect of the Department of Treasury. So he's there, and he's right around the corner from this, or right down the street from this. I mean, I believe, I looked at what I could find of a map from that time, and I think the Willard Hotel was next door to the U.S. Treasury. So Ami's completing the construction on the U.S. Treasury. By 1862, Salmon P. Chase, if you remember, he was the judge in Andrew Johnson's trial, he becomes the head of the Treasury Department. So he fires Ami Young, sadly. I think that was not the most gracious move, but you know how it is when administrations change, people, he hired a friend of his, appointed a friend of his, and I guess that happens in politics. At any rate, when he became the head of the Treasury, the person actually in charge of making the money came to him and said, we got a problem, and we need to hire women to solve this problem. And Salmon P. Chase, who was a progressive person, he was an abolitionist himself, but he said, what are you talking about? Why would we do that? And the guy said, well, all the men are enlisting to fight for the Union. So we don't have people to actually do this work. So this was, again, one of those times in wartime when women stepped in and took on jobs that men had been doing, and it helped, you know, change our society and make it the kind of world that we live in today, which is getting closer to hopefully being a just one. Who knows? At any rate, so there's Kareena Howard Nichols in Washington in the early 1860s. She's also part-time working for a reform in Washington because there are a lot of escaped slaves coming through Washington, orphan children. She's involved in all that. At this Willard Hotel in 1861, Colonel Levant Hunt, being the gentleman that he is and an officer, he stays in the Willard Hotel. Amos Hastings is across the river in Alexandria getting ready to go into the Peninsular campaign. And then a little bit, Amos signs up in October. Levant Hunt is here in October, and in that same time frame, I think in that fall, William Czar Bradley comes to visit his granddaughter Sarah. So he's staying in the hotel. President Lincoln is staying in the hotel. President Lincoln has come there and he has forgotten his slippers. And this isn't the best photograph. I used my cell phone. But these slippers are at the Windsor Historical Society, and these are the slippers that William Bradley loaned to President Lincoln so that he wouldn't be without slippers that night. So it's just fascinating to me how all these worlds can come together. And we're coming to the last person here, which is timely. I was hoping to do this in an hour. This is Larkin Goldsmith Mead. His father had tried to help Kareena and Nichols a little bit. They're all from Brattleboro. His house, as far as I know, is not there anymore either. He was born in 1835 in New Hampshire, in Chesterfield, across the river, the whole Upper Valley community again. But his family eventually moves to Brattleboro. And again, if you want to see, some remnant of this person's life, if you go to the Brooks Memorial Library in Brattleboro, and you might want to call ahead because I think this one in particular, maybe both of these are in a locked room just to make sure they're protected and there's, they're not subject to vandalism. But that's a statue that he did, a marble statue. This is famous in terms of his life because when he was coming of age, he wanted to be an artist. He wanted to be a sculptor. And he went to New York City and studied under a well-known sculptor of the time, Henry Kirk Brown. But then he came back to Brattleboro and, how do you find a job as a sculptor? So he went to work in a hardware store. But in 1856, on New Year's Eve, there was a snowstorm. And, I suppose on a whim, he and some friends of his, the Burnham boys, went out in the storm and started piling up snow. And Larkin sculpted a snow sculpture. He carved a snow sculpture like they do on the green in Hanover, the ice sculptures and so on. And the next morning when the residents of Brattleboro woke up and came out on the street, there was a snow sculpture of this recording angel. It was a sign that at the end of the year, we're going to look at your, how have you been naughty or nice this last year, and we'll see if you go through St. Peter's Gate. I'm not sure exactly, but something like that. You can see she's got a little book here, and I think maybe a stylus or a pen or something. Anyway, this was kind of an event in Brattleboro. No doubt the newspapers picked it up. In fact, the word traveled far and wide, and a gentleman by the name of Mr. Longworth in Ohio was so impressed by this that he commissioned 2 marble statues. And that started Larkin Mead off on his career of being a sculptor. He got a commission to do agriculture, the statue on the top of the Vermont State House. Now, this is not the one he did. This is the one that the Sergeant at Arms, Mr. Dwinell, did later when Mead's statue, it was wood because they were worried that a stone statue was too much weight for the dome, and the wood just wouldn't last forever. I think in late 1920s or I think it was the 1930s, they realized it was rotting. They took it down, and Dwinell, in typical Vermont fashion or Yankee fashion, said, geez, it's going to cost a lot to replace that. And they took it into a workshop out back, and Dwinell and some buddies of his for weeks and weeks carved their own folk art statue of the goddess Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, and put her back up on the Capitol. So I thought that was good. Probably saved my grandparents a little tax money, and in that do-it-yourself Yankee style. That, by the way, I just heard this last week. They've discovered that this statue has also got some rot. They're taking it down. They're going to replace it. I don't know what they're going to do. He also got the commission to sculpt Ethan Allen at the portico at the entrance. So there's some interesting stories about all this. I don't want to take too long. We can go into it if you want to know more. He does these. He also does a pretty famous statue of Lincoln, another one besides this. He does one for the Lincoln's Memorial out in Springfield, Illinois. And there are 3 sculptors really from New Hampshire, if you consider that Mead was born in Chesterfield. So he did the one in Springfield on the giant memorial. You can look this up on the internet. Augustus St. Gaudens did the one in Chicago's Lincoln Park, and you know St. Gaudens down the river in Cornish. And then another New Hampshire sculptor named Daniel French from, I think from Exeter, did the seated Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. So 3 New Hampshire sculptors doing that kind of work. When Meade died, he moved to Italy, and he saw a girl walking down the street one day, and he fell in love like Boccaccio with, what's her name? I don't know, I forget, but he fell in love with this woman and he married her. Her name was Marietta Benvenuto, di Benvenuto. When he died, the governor sent his condolences to her, and she sent the people of Vermont this bust of Lincoln, which is, if you go to the Capitol in Vermont and walk in the front door and go straight back, this is right in front of you. And I think that's probably a good place to bookend, because we started near the beginning with Ami Young designing the Vermont State House, and we'll end it here an hour later, and thank you for your patience.